We are back. So the next session is going to be chaired by my colleague Rachel Grew, who's also the co-organizer for this event today. So thank you, Rachel, for being here and helping us, with the organization. So I think you wanted to introduce the speakers first.
Okay, welcome everyone. So this is our roundtable panel that is kind of dealing with AI and cultural heritage from a range of different perspectives. I think I'll kind of just introduce the speakers in sort of just give their names, and then I'll let them perhaps say a few words about themselves to sort of so they can kind of say the things that they feel is sort of the most relevant. Okay, so we have here Dr. Kathryn Brown from Loughborough University. Kathryn, are you here? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Yes, thanks very much, Rachel. Kathryn Brown. I work in part, I'm an art historian, but I work at the intersection of digital humanities and art history, and indeed published a volume with Routledge in 2020 that drew together a lot of the scholarship in this area. I'll stop there.
Fine, that's fine. And next, Ahmed, I mean, you've probably introduced yourself already, but for anyone who has just joined us, do you want to give us another introduction?
Yes, I'm Ahmed Elgammal. I'm a professor of computer science at Rutgers University in New Jersey, USA. I am working on artificial intelligence, in particular computer vision. And also in the last 10 years, I've been working on the intersection of art and AI, founding a lab called the Art and AI Lab, looking at this intersection.
Thank you very much. And we also have Guzden Varinlioglu, and I apologize for my very poor pronunciation of people's names. So Guzden, I believe you're at MIT, and do you want to introduce yourself a little more?
Yes, thanks, Rachel. So I'm a Fulbright visiting scholar at MIT at the Department of Architecture at Computational Design. So my background is architecture, and I will be talking about some recent projects that we are doing in our lab here and back in Turkey.
Wonderful, thank you. And we also have Chao Tayiana from African Digital Heritage.
Hello everyone, my name is Chao. I am a digital heritage specialist and digital humanities scholar based in Nairobi, Kenya. My work focuses on the kind of intersections of African heritage and digital technologies. So a lot of the time I look at everything from digitization to digital engagement, digital archiving, dissemination, and the likes. I work with a lot of museums and libraries to train on digital thinking and critical thinking within digitization as well. And I'm also the co-founder of the Museum of British Colonialism, a volunteer initiative. It's a purely online museum, as well as co-founder of the Open Restitution Africa project. Thank you. And I'll speak more about them as we proceed. Yeah.
That's wonderful, thank you. And last but absolutely by no means least, we have Claire Warwick from Durham University, if I'm not very much mistaken. So Claire.
Hello, yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Claire Warwick. I'm a professor of digital humanities at Durham. I am interested in the intersection of technology and cultural heritage, particularly in terms of understanding how users engage with cultural heritage materials, especially in museums, as a result of the use of digital technologies. So yeah, I'm going to be talking a bit more about that shortly.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, I think that's everyone. Please do correct me if I'm wrong. I'm really sorry. I should say to everyone that I am operating on very little sleep, having had a sick child that was up all night. So I'm a little bit fuzzy. So if I'm getting the details wrong or anything like that, please do correct me. So each of our panelists is going to respond to a question which I will put in the chat so that all our participants can see it and kind of refer to it. So the question that everyone is responding to is, what are the most significant challenges and or developments in digital technology in the field of cultural heritage, and how might these bring changes to that field? So if we kind of proceed then in the order that you introduced yourselves, and if each of our panelists want to give 5 minutes or so to answer that question, and then we can kind of open it up to broader discussion across the panel, and indeed with all the other participants as well. So I'm just going to put the question in the chat so we can all kind of see it and refer to it as needed. So Kathryn, we're going to come to you first.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, Rachel. And you're not fuzzy at all. You're not pixelating. You're perfectly coherent. Thank you very much for this. As I mentioned, in 2020, I edited this volume for Routledge on digital art history, and it was really a terrific opportunity for me both to get to know people working in the field and also just to explore the sheer breadth of work that's being done at this intersection of art history, museology, and computer science. So following on from that, I'm currently working with one of the contributors to that volume, Professor James Wang, and his team at Penn State University. And we're working on a project that's been funded by the British Academy, where we're doing a computer vision analysis of late works by Claude Monet, hence my virtual background that you can see at the moment. So we're building a convolutional neural network to try to answer specific questions about the style and dating of late works by Monet. And we're just at the beginning of that, but even just so far, what we've done, and with my sort of discussions with various people at museums, this collaboration is throwing up various issues and I just want to mention 3. The first one concerns the relationship between what we're doing in conservation studies. Conservators work for years looking at the surfaces of maybe, half a dozen paintings in some cases. And it seems very incongruous to them for us to come along and say, well, we're building an algorithm to analyze, I don't know, 100, 150, 200 digitized paintings to try to make deductions from, brush strokes and so on, the sort of thing that Ahmed has just been talking to us about, in fact. And in fact, I also had one conservator say to me, you're just going to throw things into a computer program. And they felt very depressed by that idea. And of course, that's nonsense. We don't just throw things into a computer program. And in fact, you need, what I'm finding, very precise art historical research questions and background conservation data in order to determine the parameters of the machine learning. It sounds very obvious, but it's not to the people who are coming at this from a different angle. So what we're doing may be testing certain assumptions in conservation, but we're not trying to debunk those ideas, which is one of the problems that conservators seem to have. Rather, it's a case of seeing how those ideas can be further nuanced or developed. And as I say, as art historians, we have to be very specific about what the AI is being trained to do. So it's not an either or. I think AI can obviously provide new insight because it works at a level beyond human vision. But it needs to be understood in that archival and historical framework of other visual and physical evidence. So I think that's an important conversation to have with conservators. The second issue I want to mention is social history of art versus formalism. And I think this is another area where the use of AI starts to make art historians get goosebumps. A lot of historians understand art as being inextricably linked to the social context of its production, and that extends to the very idea of what art actually is. And I think one reason that art historians are suspicious about computer vision is that it seems like a return to formalism, so an approach that, and again I say seems, to dispense with the wider issues that shape or impact on different styles of art production. Well, is that right? Well, my answer is no, I don't think it is right for various reasons, and I'll just mention 2 of them. First of all, I think that pattern recognition is an important part of art history itself. It affects a lot of individual and workshop creativity, whether we're talking about Renaissance workshops to Impressionist seriality. Artists often rework, recycle motifs, repurpose them in aesthetically interesting ways. And I just draw attention to Elizabeth Honig's work at Berkeley, where she's done a computer vision analysis with a team on 16th century Netherlandish and Flemish workshop practices by tracing the repetition of figures across works. So, I mean, that's a situation where you've got digital techniques being used not just to look at the formal qualities of works, but also to shed light on working methods themselves. So there is, in fact, an intersection, a meaningful intersection between the computer vision analysis and actually a social history of art production. The second thing I'd mention there is that pattern recognition has played an historically important role in art history. And again, I think Ahmed has drawn attention to that in his work. And it also is interesting because it tells us something about the discipline itself. And I'd mention in this context, Leo Impet's work on the digital analysis of gesture. And he also contributed to my Routledge volume. So he's working from digitized images, developing a computational history of gesture that connects that to Abby Warburg's pathos formula, and also to Michael Baxendall's investigation of 15th century Italian gesture. So using computer vision to go deeper into the iconography in that way, not just tests hypotheses around how gesture is created, but it also reveals something about the historiography of the discipline itself. So again, I think broadening our reflection on art history. I don't know how I'm going for time, but Rachel, I've got one more point, so I'll just quickly whiz through it. And that concerns criticality. And here I come to what's probably become a sort of slightly infamous article from 2015 by Claire Bishop, called Against Digital Art History, where Bishop worried that art history was being subordinated to computational analysis, but her concern wasn't just methodological. She also thought that digital art history perpetuated, and I quote, uncritical assumptions about the intrinsic value of statistics. So we're being basically steamrolled, she suggested, by data. And I'll just mention one other thing she said. It assumes a post-historical position where the data is out there, gathered and complete. All that remains is for scholars to sequence it at will. Well, A, that makes things sound pretty easy. So, you know, tough luck for all those computer scientists out there. And secondly, we're just packaging everything. We're just reading stuff that's out there. It seems like a pretty naive view to me. But I'll just mention four reasons why I think that view is wrong. Firstly, working with large data sets does not assume that the answers, or let alone the questions, are pre-packaged. And I think, as I said at the very beginning, we as humanists need to reframe our questions, and can be encouraged to do so by working with machine learning. Secondly, the interpretative aspects of art history are by no means lost. Algorithms may help us to isolate aspects of the microsurfaces of canvases, but there's still work to be done in giving that meaning. Thirdly, getting it wrong is interesting. I think, you know, what the machine learning can and can't do is actually interesting, and I won't go into it, but Elizabeth Mansfield has just written a nice article in 19th Century Art Worldwide, where she talks about a project that she's involved in and is also interested in where the AI has blind spots and how that helps her reflect on her practice as an art historian. And finally, you know, coming back to a point that I think came out of the last two papers, working in teams is different for us humanists. It's interesting and it creates new kinds of tensions and possibilities. But I think that bringing the humanities and the computer scientists together in this context can produce fresh results and also bring about a new method of sort of academic sociability. And I think when people have conversations and talk to each other, that can only be a good thing. And that's where I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kathryn. I think there's a lot of food for thought there. Before I come to Ahmed, I must apologise. My fuzziness is already in evidence this morning because I've left out Victoria Lemieux from our list of panelists. So I'm really sorry, Victoria. Do you want to kind of jump in and introduce yourself a little bit? I know you've given some stuff in the chat here, but just to speak to everyone as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. No worries, Rachel. It's early for me too, so I'm just waking up. Hello, everyone. I'm Victoria Lemieux. I'm an associate professor of archival science at the School of Information at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, situated on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. So I'm going to turn it back over to our next panelist to respond, and I look forward to joining in the discussions very shortly. Thanks so much, Rachel. It's great to be here.
No worries, and apologies again. So Ahmed, we'll come to you now then for your response to this question.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with many of the points that Kathryn made, and I want to basically highlight some of these issues from my point of view, and others as well. So I think one of the biggest challenges in this area is there is no one AI that fits all. So we digitize our data and we think that we are done, can now use AI and machine learning algorithm to whatever analysis you want to do. And it's not true, because the way AI unfortunately is right now, it's very problem specific. You really have to develop AI for the specific problem and understand what is the question trying to answer, and which requires these kind of collaborations. So this is unfortunate reality, which is actually fortunate, because that would mean that we have to work on teams and really understand what are the questions and what are the solutions we need to develop together. So that's some of the misconception I always find when I talk to people from digital humanities, who think once you digitize the data, I can now use whatever tools available. And it's not the case. And the other issue is because of this issue, let's come back to one of the issues that Kathryn has mentioned. People have to realize, obviously, that babies, for example, don't born to walk. Babies crawl first and then start to find the way to walk and then run. So we are at that early stage of doing AI machine learning for digital humanities. We're just having baby steps, and most of the criticism I received and other people received are always like, basically, why don't you run, kind of thing. I mean, basically, yes, we understand that there are a lot of issues that we don't address and we don't take into account when doing our studies. And you cannot solve everything in once. You have to take baby steps towards a solution. So, for example, when it comes to art history, yes, as Kathryn mentioned, most of work that involved computer vision is focused on formal analysis of art, not taking into account the historical or social context of art at all. But doesn't mean that we don't care about that, or that's not important. It's just basically you are taking baby steps to really make the very basic abilities for the machine to even understand an artwork. As I mentioned, in an artwork, you have to quantify a lot of things, and nothing exists to do that. So any baby steps in that direction would help in the future start integrating other sources of data as it becomes available, and available framework that can integrate more social information, historical information, to go beyond the formalism into other things. So I always find this is the main criticism coming from humanities in general, who try to not understanding that we have to take these baby steps. I'll stop here to give a chance for other people to comment.
That's great, thank you. I'm already beginning to see some interesting themes coming out in the panel discussion. And as we're talking, if any of the attendees have questions for the panel, do feel free to write them in the chat or in the Q&A section, and we can always kind of come to those in sort of the second half of the discussion. But for now, we'll move on to Guzden.
Yeah. Rachel, can I start by sharing my screen? I just prepared some, just a second. I hope it works. Yes. You can see, right? Okay, so I like, more than answering the questions, I want to raise a little bit more questions actually in this field. So my point of view, as my background is architecture, my questions will be more covering the 3D aspects of the heritage sites, like the archaeological and architectural heritage. So I'm here now. It's like I'm originally from Izmir University of Economics, but here I'm at a visiting scholar project here that is about the networks of the past along the Silk Roads of Anatolia, using like some computational tools. But before I go explaining about my projects, I want to like kind of frame the technology that is a cure for the preservation of archaeological heritage or architectural heritage. So this is an image that is about a heritage under threat. So that's the destruction of the heritage sites in Iraq that happened in 2015. And actually, unfortunately, we are going through another war, another destruction. So we cannot change this part of the history, but definitely I want to emphasize some of the digital archaeologists, they call themselves, because through this fact that this destruction was filmed, video streamed through social media, they took these videos and they reconstructed these lost heritage through photogrammetric tools, for example. That's like one of the impressive projects that I wanted to underline. So how can we really avoid destruction? The second one is kind of a precaution before the destruction. Like, can we really collect this huge amount of data from the Earth, means like scanning the whole Earth surface, and especially with the focus of cultural heritage site through LiDAR or any other remote sensing technology in order to preserve digitally this cultural heritage. Or maybe that's another very impressive project. So what happens if we collect the data from the landmark, from the tourists, from unstructured data from the landmarks, and what happens if we try to reconstruct this heritage through totally unorganized data of the photographs? So that's, you know, another project that we can really think about. Or can we use crowdsourcing? That's another impressive project. Actually, two projects I want to call it like armchair archaeology, where they use the crowdsourcing. So during the pandemic time, using the satellite imagery, can we use the people to scan, like visually scan, means the power of the human actually, and like find and discover some archaeological sites. So these are some projects that, you know, inspired me a lot during my research. And very shortly, I tell about, you know, my recent project that I'm working on that includes computational and biological computation, so unconventional computation in the discovery of the Silk Roads of Anatolia. And my starting point is Caravansaray, or in short, these are the these are the inns or hotels along the Silk Road, so as architectural evidences of these roads. So I tried two methods, two AI methods for this project. First of all, the computer vision. Can we use the computer to train and to have this very typical plan type of these buildings? And can we train the computer to find and discover other caravansarais, like other ruins from the satellite image? That was the first one. And the second stage was that if we think about an agent-based system, can we really use the agents, of course here the deep reinforcement learning, to find the shortest way in between these caravansarais? Because the idea is that usually they're like placed in a rhythm along the topography, in the 3D topography, so it shouldn't be that difficult to find their location if we have like some simulation tools. So still, you know, that's still a project, an ongoing project. I'm in the first 3 months of my project, but like, you know, I want to show a few examples from, again, as a designer and architect, actually, can we really use digital technologies in order to disseminate the data? So some of the projects that I did, like some virtual reality projects, some mobile games, or a virtual museum of underwater culture heritage. I know that the streaming is a little bit slow, but can we use the digital tools to disseminate the data to the public? Because archiving means like collecting, analyzing, and of course, publishing is not enough. Can we include the people in the heritage fields more, like the regular public? So these are the questions that I wanted to emphasize and raise, Rachel, I think. So if you want any more, if you want to ask me more questions, that's my email. That's it, yes.
That's great, thank you, and thank you also for the images at the very end there, and the different kind of forms of dissemination. I think there's a lot of different things that we could pick up on, I think. So yeah, I'm looking forward to exploring these and expanding. But next we have Chao. So Chao, would you like to give your response?
Yeah, absolutely. When I think of the question, I am slightly approaching it from a different perspective. I think as a digital humanist, you have to sometimes choose which hat you want to wear, and I'll approach the development question from a humanist perspective. And for me, one of the most significant developments in digital technology within cultural heritage, I think I will refer to it in the context of like our current landscape, which is COVID-19, and how that has seemed to accelerate an interest in digital technologies. I would say maybe five years ago, so it would be very hard to walk into a museum and kind of, here in Kenya at least, and pitch the idea of why digital technology is important. But what we're seeing now with COVID, but also with a kind of awareness of what digital technologies can do amongst audiences, amongst institutions, is that the digital technology is not new in itself, but the uptake and the kind of acceptance and warming up to it is definitely different. So for me, within this field of like development and developmental thinking as a whole within digitization, it's very interesting what these digital projects are allowing people to do with the data. As a previous speaker has just presented, we are doing some projects here in Kenya in which we are creating 3D visualizations of detention camps that were set up in the colonial period. We are combining oral history, archives, and physical remains, on-site remains, to create these visualizations. And so this ability to not just base, I think, your work on one set of data. I think digital technology really presents us with opportunity to create and to understand history from a very different vantage point as opposed to using one source. So that's a big development for me, in the ways in which it's bringing in new audiences as well. And the freedom, I think a lot of my work looks at digital technology as both a freedom to exist outside the kind of colonial constructs of history and the way it has been told and presented. And so that is a big development. But on the flip side, I would say some of the challenges that we are seeing is, one, I think our rush to digitize, which in itself is prioritizing quantity over quality. And I know that, we're talking about AI and we're talking about machine learning and we need huge data sets. But at the same time, I am concerned both as a practitioner and also as someone who is interacting with these data sets about the quality of the data that is being produced. Specifically, not just the images, but more so the metadata. From a museum perspective, I work with museums a lot. And so a lot of material that was collected from indigenous communities during colonial periods exists in museums as incomplete data, racialized data, inaccurate data. And what does it mean that we're digitizing en masse hundreds of thousands of objects without questioning the actual metadata structures and underpinnings that uphold this data? And then what does it mean furthermore to train networks with this data in mind. And so I think this quantity versus quality thing is important to look at within the context of AI, within the context of collections. I speak to the collections aspect in particular, and how do we create a room, I think, for dialogue. Yes, we're working with machines and we're training machines for this kind of networks, but I think the first speaker of the day pointed us to the direction of creating relationships both within people, even within this machine learning process. So it is, I mean, I have asked a lot of questions, but these are some of the issues that I am seeing kind of play out at the moment.
That's brilliant, thank you. And again, a great deal of food for thought and things that are sort of making connections with other things that have already been raised. So that's great, thank you. So now moving on to Claire. Claire, would you like to give us your response?
Sure, yeah. It's actually been very interesting to hear other speakers talk before I'm able to talk, and that's been really helpful to me in the sense that something that I wanted to raise that other speakers seem to be talking about is the question of user expectations. So one of the things that we see with the use of many digital technologies, but in particular AI, is the hype cycle. And I think one of the things that this is going to be one of the challenges for the use of digital technologies in cultural heritage, and particularly in AI, because the use of AI tends to go in waves, and at the moment we're in one of those waves where it's particularly intensive, and a lot of people are getting quite excited about this. And unfortunately, what that tends to cause sometimes is over, how should we put it, hype, basically, people overhyping the potential of the technology. And this then can lead to a lack of trust from users, but also a lack of a sort of discomfort with some of the claims that are being made. So I think, it's interesting that Kathryn was talking about, articles which have been saying, well, there's really no use for this technology, or Ahmed talking about, people saying we should run before we can walk. And I think it's very important that we take those kind of user reactions, whether they're from professional colleagues or from the users in, museum visitors or archival users, because what we've learned from previous iterations of the use of other types of digital technologies in the humanities and cultural heritage is that if we overstate, or if those who sell the technology or create the algorithms overstate its potential utility, then a kind of trough of disillusion tends to follow. And at the moment, I think this is why the movements towards explainable AI are so important, because there has been a danger that the expectations for AI are at the moment overheated, which can mean that also it's very interesting that Chao was talking about the effect of the pandemic on the use of digital technologies and AI. And you can see that there's been a kind of, a lot of museums moved online, but we're already seeing, my PhD student, Ellen Charlesworth, has been doing some very interesting work with AI, looking at the prevalence of digital exhibitions and digital material for museums on platforms such as YouTube. And she's already finding a considerable falling off of the use of digital methods. So I think one can see, therefore, that there's this potential. What tends to happen is almost the implication that digital is so great it's going to replace everything human, and that's clearly behind the fears that Kathryn was talking about in terms of that article, and similar articles, the famous or infamous Stanley Fish blogs about digital humanities back 10 years ago, same kind of anxiety. And that comes from this perception that, some people perceive that what we are saying is digital will replace everything human. That is, of course, not what we're saying, but that is the danger of some of the hype. And so I think, at the moment, what I'm interested in at the moment is this sense of what happens post-pandemic? You know, there's already the kind of the phrase of museums thinking that they are post-digital. You know, I've heard that being used as if, you know, digital is just kind of yesterday's thing, and we all want to, you know, it was just something to do with the pandemic, and therefore not anything we really want to think about. So I think there are all these, you know, I think AI, obviously, as we've been hearing, AI has potential to be extremely useful and very, very, you know, to used in very interesting ways. But I think it's extremely important that we are aware of the hype, and we are aware of this kind of anxiety that people are being replaced, and therefore we are realistic about what AI can do, and we think very carefully about the explicability of the algorithms and the techniques that we're using. Thanks.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Claire. I just want to kind of move quickly on because I'm aware of time. So I'm going to move quickly on to Victoria for your final response.
Thank you. So yes, it's been very interesting listening to everyone's thoughts and remarks. And so I'll just maybe pick it up with framing what I'm going to say by mentioning that between 2011 and 2016, roughly, I worked in a research area called visual analytics, which essentially is the combination of artificial intelligence and visualization, where analysis is done with a human in the loop. So picking up on this theme of formalism versus emphasis on sociocultural context and that tension that exists. Through visual analytics, I found an opportunity to keep the human engaged in the AI so that it wasn't just a question of, you know, okay, algorithm consumes data and there's output, and what does it actually mean and how did it actually get there? But there's a conversation that happens between the machine, machine cognition and machine vision or computer vision, and human cognition and human vision. So it's a really interesting combination of the two, and perhaps suggests a way forward. The other thing I learned from doing visual analytics between 2011 and 2016 was about how much transformation goes on in the process of preparing data for this kind of analysis, for running algorithms over the data. It's in a lot of the projects that I was involved in, about 80% of the work went into actually scraping the data, refining the data, because it would inevitably be dirty data with lots of, you know, misplaced metadata or missing metadata, and you had to really clean it, is the language used. And then sometimes you actually had to transform the data so you had to change it, what they call change its shape, so that data that is presented as one type would be somehow transformed into another type that was consumable by the machine. So then what this to me raised the question of is, of course, resources. There's a lot that goes into this, 80% of your time. It's very resource intensive. But more importantly, from my perspective, was what does this do to authenticity? If we take the data at the beginning and we start with something that is a record, let's say an archival document, at the end of it, do we have, it's like the story of Theseus's ship. You know, if we change every component of Theseus's ship along the way, do we still have Theseus's ship at the end of the journey? So to me, engaging with AI this way raised those kinds of questions about authenticity. What was it I was really looking at? And at the end of the day, when we transform data, we maybe present the archival documents or artifacts or artworks in these new forms, are we really looking at the authentic artwork, or is this some new representation that has its own story to tell? And then finally, and I'll get into this a little bit more in my talk coming up, but I just wanted to flag the issue of privacy, because what I discovered in my journey applying visual analytics to Twitter data, was that the power of this gaze, this computational gaze on an archive, actually revealed a lot more than people who had originally maybe tweeted out their messages or written their documents had ever intended. And should we think more deeply about that? And I think we should, and I'll talk about that coming up. So I'll leave you with those thoughts.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Victoria.